adequate headlights. And then vehicle design, and you'll see this in mine in terms of vehicles in Idaho. We have a growing percentage of high-profile vehicle sales, particularly pickup trucks and SUVs, that the impact area that they hit a pedestrian is here in the vital area, the torso, not the legs that a standard passenger vehicle would come at. And if you look at frontal crash test rating in Europe, the frontal crash test ratings in Europe for cars are based on also impacts and lessening that to pedestrians. Our frontal impact ratings in the United States are based on impact to drivers, and then because of that we have higher frontal impact ratings on SUVs and high-profile trucks, because if they hit a car, the damage is not done to the operator of that. So this is the depth. Everybody is starting to look at this issue and change the paradigm. And so we'll start with the Utah stuff. And in some of this, I have to remember what she presented in November and go through some of the key points of that. Once we're done with that, I'm going to present on a project we're working on with Idaho Department of Health and Welfare, looking at the economic costs and benefits of both walking and bicycling in general in Idaho, as well as crash analysis of 20 years worth of data for the state. So this one, Pedestrian Safety Research in Utah, they have a lot of momentum just like we have, but because of the growth in the Salt Lake Valley, they have a lot of groups interested in it. The Utah DOT director stood up at this summit and said, "We cannot widen highways forever. Our goal has to be getting people safely to Utah Transit Authority, trains and buses and other features, and giving people other options." So to have a state DOT director stand up and say that is pretty significant, and it's driving a lot of the research and understanding of this. The fact that in Idaho, the Department of Health and Welfare is interested in it. We've also been doing walkability trainings for Utah Department of Health. So that's how this paradigm is shifting. So one of the things in Utah, how many of you have walked on a Utah road? What's it like? What's that? Depends on the road. What's the history of Utah road widths? Why are they that way? Wagons, super wide, and even going back to some of the Mormon town planning concepts. And so as they acknowledge in this study, the systems have historically been designed for cars, not pedestrians, and most areas barely accommodate them. So they looked at high-risk intersection research for 5 years worth of data and broke it down in Salt Lake County, the other counties that are kind of there in the area on the Wasatch Front, and then more fringe or rural counties to see what some of the differences and changes were. And that's really the focus of the work they did. So in looking at that, most places have really good crash data. For example, in the crash data for Idaho back to 1997, I'm looking at 20,000 crash records in a spreadsheet. One record for the victim, one record for the driver. And so usually in those that are taken from police reports, we get some really good information, but as you'll see in Utah, they found some flaws in the information that's there. They looked at things like the characteristics of the intersection from a design standpoint to see how those things might be contributory toward it. And if you've heard the phrase Vision Zero, or going to attend what Chris and I are presenting this afternoon, looking at design as contributory to crashes is critical in this movement. And then in some of the ones, I think in Salt Lake in particular, they actually looked at video of intersections to look at things like crashes and near miss to actually understand the function that was going on. So in the urban core, some of the things they found in Salt Lake City that were contributory to this: peak signal length. And we know from FHWA research, if you make a pedestrian wait more than 40 seconds on average, the likelihood of them not complying with the pedestrian signals is high. Once that reaches 60 seconds, it's very high. And so stand on a Salt Lake City intersection corner at 5 p.m. in the afternoon and your wait time can be 2.5, 3 minutes. They're certainly different than here. I think except for maybe Front and Myrtle, our cycle links in our downtown core here in Boise are pretty good and pretty balanced. Dedicated right turn lanes were a contributory factor to that in terms of reduced certainty. And what they talk about in that was interesting is that the pedestrian, when they see somebody in a right turn lane, kind of knows what they're doing. versus if it's a through right. So a little bit different, even though right turn lanes add it, they found that there was more certainty and predictability in that. Sidewalk width. Most of the time we default to a minimum sidewalk width that in ADA says 4 minimum, 5 preferred. And putting that next to a road is decreases what's called pedestrian level or quality of service. And certainly roadways that were built up in the 60s, 70s where we've done kind of minimal attached sidewalks without a buffer, those have some other safety issues versus you'll see in downtown Salt Lake, you've got sidewalks that are maybe 16 feet from the road on some buffers, which is really good for that. Street trees being a part of it. Why are street trees important to pedestrian safety? What's that?
Shield between them.
Okay, so it provides both a real and a perceived buffer. What else?
Traffic calming, like making it seem...
Okay, breaks down kind of that visual prism of the drivers and yields more focus. And there's some studies that in combination with other factors can slow speeds. When we were doing some walk audit work in Salt Lake City in West Jordan last summer, it was a 100-degree day. And we were out at different locations, and I had a smart level that also has a thermometer on it. And we stood for about 7 or 8 minutes at a roundabout that had really close in and good tree coverage. And on a 100-degree day, that temperature reading was 95 degrees. We went out to like a 7-lane by 7-lane intersection, standing on the corner to kind of talk about the features of it. And after about the same 7 or 8 minutes, the reading on that thermometer was 119. So think about that. Think about somebody waiting for a bus that only runs every 30 minutes out there. Or if you have a cycle length that is 3 minutes and you see a gap in traffic and you feel 119 degrees, you might feel tempted to shoot the gap. It's a comfort thing. So those are all issues. And then construction zones, especially in fast-growing areas, being particularly bad for bikes. One, the termination of a bike lane that forces you into a shared lane situation on a high-speed road. And then things like an overlay, that they'll just go in and mill up the concrete or the asphalt, but it'll leave a very rigid surface that's very tough. And there's not a lot of easy solutions for that particular one. Moving to the suburban zone, so getting out into Weber, Davis, and Utah counties. Roadway width and the number of through lanes were found to be a factor. Peak signal length, especially as you get out of the downtown core, those signal links tend to be longer. Non-residential driveways within 100 meters. We still see that, especially in development done probably up through the 90s of that gas station that has 2 driveways right there at the intersection corner. And certainly that's always a trade-off and more of a political discussion sometimes to get access control. And then construction in those areas bad for both bicyclists and pedestrians. If you're on a wide suburban road and a sidewalk chunk is gone or a sidewalk is under construction, it's not as easy as the downtown grid where maybe a 1-block detour is there, but out there it could be a 1-mile detour to come across, or somebody who's disabled and not giving adequate notice to get there and have to turn around and reroute. So those were the findings in those particular zones. Yeah?
You skipped green turn arrows. Can you mention that?
Oh, okay. So I think those were related to the protected permissive movements and what's going on there. So times when a pedestrian has a walk signal crossing here and drivers are also permitted to turn at the same time, so creating conflicts there. Rural areas, crashes clustered along main corridors, and you'll really see this come out when I talk about the Idaho data. In a lot of these towns and smaller communities, much like here, the state highway is also the main street and also the central business district. And so you get different conflicts of vehicular movement and truck movement and things in rural areas. That's different. Higher speed limits, more dangerous. No surprise there when we look at pedestrian fatality rates, at that classic at 40 miles an hour, a 90% chance of death, at 20 miles an hour, a 10% chance of death. But if you take seniors and children, you can bump that up 10. So that 90% chance of fatality usually happens around a 30 mile an hour mark when we start to get into some of those. And you could see, especially if a small community is bisected by a high-speed road, where that would be an issue. Number of lanes, obviously crossing distances, and in rural areas where you don't have signals every block, you're going to have wide, unprotected crossings that don't have the protection of a signal phase. It might just be a crosswalk or some other type of yield-based traffic control device there. And then this was interesting. The presence of bike lanes correlated to more pedestrian crashes. Why would you think that's the case?
Distracting drivers to many variables.
Okay, so a field of vision issue came up as one. Yep, what else? Anything?
Does that include cyclists hitting pedestrians?
No, but that's such a small number. It was more related to they add width to the road. So a 5-foot bike lane is 10 feet wider, so more crossing distance, more of a wide open field of vision there. And this was one, I think, for them that intrigued them the most. They want to look at that issue a little deeper. Downtown Salt Lake has now what are called protected intersections, that out at kind of the apex of the turn, there's a concrete island that slows turning vehicles down and are out there kind of in front of the bike lane that's there. I'm not describing them really well, but if you look up protected intersection, and it almost has the result of like a curb extension for pedestrians and doing that. So I know harder for them to do in some of these rural areas, but that's the model that downtown Salt Lake is starting to look at. So getting into pedestrian travel behavior at intersections, they looked at both the decision-making and the behavioral component, which the good part about video analysis is you can actually do those things. And God bless what were probably well-paid graduate students who were sitting there looking through all of that and coding these things. 8 high-risk intersections. They looked at 1,221 total pedestrian crossings from those cameras, so that many movements of pedestrians across the road. I looked at other things, so I'm sorry these are small. 12% of all pedestrians were distracted in some way, and we know we've seen that coming as an issue, but what I find is most frequently they cataloged distracted as socializing. Do we ever tell drivers, don't socialize while driving? Yeah, I mean, I thought that was interesting. Majority of conflicts occurred when a vehicle was turning right. 48% of that occurring. So while the through movement or the right movement is given the green, you have the walk signal at a high-speed road, a high-speed turning radius, and they're whipping around there doing those things. Vehicles frequently stop beyond the stop bar, impeding the crosswalk. We see that in a lot of instances as well, 17.1%. And then some interesting stuff. Pedestrians walking alone, 400% more likely to experience a conflict than those walking in a group. Why would that be? Yeah, if we're 5 of us, we have a wider profile. You know, we're more noticeable versus that one singular person that maybe a tree, a traffic signal controller box, a sign, other things can obstruct. Less likely to do that in large groups. And then here it gets to the age risk, which will show some of this in the Idaho data too. 18 to 60 face only 4% of the likelihood of being involved in a serious conflict when compared to seniors. So why might that be? Reaction time? Yeah, get out of the way.
You're in the crosswalk longer because you're going slow.
Your walk speed is slower.
Your eyesight is worse. You can't judge distances as well.
Okay. And why do seniors look down? Afraid of a fall. And so they're not looking at a phone, they're doing this because that fear, that broken hip, that fall in the street. And so yeah, everything about their awareness is very different for that. Do you have a question, Greg?
Yeah, have you seen, because you said a lot of these right turn accidents are happening, it's more, have you seen where there's a higher level of pedestrian or bicycle crossings that they've removed the right on red?
I have not. There was an interesting one this week that came out. The rights on red were largely prohibited before the gas crisis of the 70s. And as a way to kind of speed that up and help with efficiencies, that's when we went to more permissive of right turn on red. So now they're kind of going, do we need to go back and rethink those because of some of those potential conflicts?
Because I'm sure all of us as drivers, when you have a right turn on red, you're going to creep into the crosswalk.
Yeah.
That's just what you're going to do.
It happens to my daughter on a regular basis walking to school. And part of that is, you know, they're waiting to do that. They're waiting for the right turn on red. But it also impacts, if I'm only given 4 or 7 seconds of walk lead time, I've got to overcome that obstacle while they're trying to do that as well. So yeah, a lot of things. And there's also been some I've seen that have talked about what happens if we start to reverse what we do and move traffic signals to the near side of the intersection instead of the far side. So if you get too far advanced, you can't even see it. And I know there's, I think, some European treatments for that. So yeah, all that stuff is starting to bubble up in some conversations there. And I couldn't tell from the Utah, they're still working on turning this stuff into action items like that and trying to understand it there. Yep.
There are no turn rights on red. You know, where, from a traffic engineer's perspective, how does that happen? We do go to intersections where you're not allowed to turn right on red, but it's probably traffic related, definitely not pedestrian or.
I think a little both. I have seen some right turn on reds restricted in school zones, so specialty stuff. Sometimes if there is a site obstruction or other things that would have there. I don't know, Sean, do you have, I know you kind of deal with that a lot. What are some of the other factors?
Most of it is site visits related. We restrict them.
Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, it's an interesting discussion, and maybe do we prioritize it in school zones and at senior centers or in downtowns where we might have that, or if we see a high crash location, do we try to mitigate it that way versus kind of casting it far and wide, which we can sometimes be tempted to do. So getting into some of the other research goals, one, they found limitations in crash reporting. Only 33% of crash reports contained no errors. So think about that. And I've seen this before in things where trying to understand a speed limit and you're looking at the crash report and you're going, well, the posted speed is 45. Why did they code it at 25 in there? And so if you've ever looked at a police crash report form, they're pretty dense. They're in small type because we've all done them on clipboards for years. And, you know, they're trying to get through them as fast as they can, so you're going to have some errors, but I think that was a finding. And 15% of crash reports included 3 or more errors in there. And so this whole thing about performance measures and trying to be data-driven, we need to go back and understand some fundamental things about how we're starting to report. Some other things I've seen is stuff related to like lighting. Since most pedestrian crashes occur at night, what ends up happening at a crash scene is the moment a crash happens and officers and people start to arrive, the scene is pretty well lit. And unless they're coming back and doing kind of crash recreation or other things, they may not see what those ambient lighting conditions were in a particular area. And that may vary. I think what I've seen here in Boise compared to the time that I was in Asheville, North Carolina, I think here Boise police take a little more time to sort through those versus my experience where they were kind of like quick to write it off. They wouldn't even diagram the crash in a crash report and kind of be on their way. I know there was some frustration in a recent pedestrian crash of why did it take the police a month to reach a conclusion, but I think the answer is they're trying to thoroughly piece through and do that. So it's a good time to be patient if they're trying to work through those things in a methodical way. Yeah?
So on the errors, what do you mean by errors? Just conflicting information in, or who's looking, how do you get to the errors?
I think they were looking at things that were cataloged in terms of road characteristics and other features that when they went back and physically looked at the locations, there were errors in how that was done. So, and I wish, that's when I wish Shauna was here. She'd know the other 6 or 7 things that might have been a piece of that. So crash findings, 10% of crashes occurred in inclement weather. In 90% of fatal crashes, the vehicle was traveling straight. So we talked about a lot of conflicts with right turns. The fatals ended up being straight, which is probably an indicator of braking and turning in slower speeds and reaction time versus kind of continuing at a higher rate because you weren't turning. Driver contribution, 20% distracted, 9.5% intoxicated, 5% exceeding the speed limit. Pedestrian contributions, improper crossing, improperly in the roadway. One of the interesting things I found in Utah law that we don't have in Idaho is what's the law for walking on a street without sidewalks? Face traffic. Utah law says you only have to do that on a 2-lane road. And if we look at when those laws came about, a lot of it was in the 20s and 30s. And I don't think in the 20s and 30s when we said pedestrians, if there's not a sidewalk walk facing traffic, we never conceptualized that in cities and urban areas we would have streets without sidewalks. Because they all had them. And that was meant for rural areas. And I think the expectation in a rural area with low traffic and all that, yes, cross 2 lanes, walk facing traffic. It's in an area where you're not expected. It's where I think current laws don't fit proper urban settings. Utah's law says on a 2-lane road. So if it is a multi-lane road, beyond that, that requirement is not there. And that's one of the follow-up questions I know I had for her was how were they defining some of that? When we define improper crossing, as you move out into suburban areas, we get much bigger spacing between pedestrian crossings. So if you're saying, hey, you didn't cross properly because go to the nearest crosswalk, it's 2,000 feet away, we've not really considered what we're asking of pedestrians in those situations. And a lot of times I've seen, I know errors in crash reports, I've been involved with some attorneys to correct them, where the pedestrian was hit in the crosswalk, but the force of the crash propelled them so far down. And when all you have is the testimony of the driver, I didn't see him, how do they reconcile that? I don't know if that was in their errors, but I know I've seen it as kind of a bias in some of those particular reports. Pedestrians involved in a fatal crash are 14 years older on average than those who survive. And you'll see that a little bit at the fatality rates when I talk about the senior crash data in Idaho. So what are they doing? They put together a Utah Pedestrian Safety Action Plan that I think if you want to Google it and read it, it's a pretty good cross-section of things that talks about kind of first and foremost, engineering related interventions and countermeasures to get at that. I think Utah's starting to realize the speed of their roads and the design of their roads have a contributory factor, and they've applied a lot of these standards in urban areas. One of the things they've done 2 years ago was gave crossing guards access to the signal controller boxes so they could add more time for pedestrian crossings during those times of day or when they needed them. That's a pretty good step that's there. And really they've got a lot of other research stuff there. So I really thought from what I've seen from a lot of states and the in-depth reporting, I thought they did a really good job in looking at the data. I like the way they classified it in different areas to try to understand urban, suburban, and rural to see what's going on there. And like I said, seeing a DOT head stand up and talk about those kind of things is critical. That message kind of trickles down. Did any of you happen to see the email that Roger Millar, the Secretary of Washington State DOT, sent out for Bike Month? Go Google it or something. It was pretty impressive. People may be on a bike because that's the only way they have to get to work. They may be on a bike, and it was a very well-written piece that I think just a message to the staff of agencies that maybe historically haven't seen it as in their wheelhouse to worry about. That's important. That's pretty meaningful. So I think those things are worth replicating there. So any quick questions on that? If you have some burning ones, I can get in touch with Shauna on that and see what's there. So anything real quick? Okay. So what we attempted to do with this Idaho Department of Health and Welfare work is start to at least get a comprehensive overview of what's happening in Idaho related to bicyclist and pedestrian crashes. And we also wanted to do an economic analysis of the benefits of walking and biking and hypothetically say, what if we increased our rates by 5%, by 10%, by 15%? Anybody know, anybody here from Department of Health, what are some of our main health concerns are in the state? Obesity. That's an obvious one, how more walking and biking can impact that. Diabetes. Anybody know the connection to that and more physical activity?
It's an inverse correlation.
And that means?
More walking and biking, less diabetes.
Yeah, you know, except for those cases where there's some other predisposition toward it or can't overcome it. Yeah, what about our suicide rates? Mental health. Where does Idaho rank regarding suicides? Fifth, I think. And one of the interesting things in looking through the evidence-based research is that getting 100 minutes of walking or biking has the same effect as prescription drugs when it comes to mental health. And what we're trying to do in this one with that piece of the work is not say walking is going to cure obesity or diabetes or mental health in Idaho, but what we're trying to say is this is an issue in our state, there's documented reasons for this, and as policymakers from the state on down, we have reasons to invest in that. And that's what will be profiled here. So why this analysis? Department of Health and Welfare, yeah.
Just a
Go
quick
ahead.
question. Where is that statistic?
What's that?
The one you just cited, the 100 minutes of walking and biking.
It's in the 60-page academic report I have right now that's hopefully going to turn into a 15-page layperson's report when we get this work done in this summer.
I'd love to use that with some of our foundations, our health foundations that are looking to invest in these kinds of things, but I think we need more of those kinds of statistics.
Yeah, and that's exactly why Department of Health set out to do this. Do you have something, Aaron?
I was just going to say, I have full pages of those statistics for you with the Heart Association. So we have all kinds of stats and data to try and be like.
Well, and that's exactly the reason here. You know, state departments of health are trying to make a transition to realize, well, maybe the health fair, maybe the diabetes screening isn't the type of intervention that's there, and we still have federal policy barriers for that. Try to get funding for something diabetes if you're not doing screenings or other things. So they've made way the last few years to look at this in depth, and it started 3 or 4 years ago with what were called activity connection plans in 20 different small towns in Idaho. And it was based on the premise that take a Jerome, Idaho, take a Rupert, Idaho, and go, could they ever have the resources to do a bike ped plan, a parks and rec, trails and greenways plan, and a health programming plan and put all those together? Heck no, we struggle to get that in some of our largest cities with the most resources. So how can we combine those kind of things and give some short-term small town solutions to communities? We've been doing, as Cynthia mentioned this morning, the walkability trainings. We're going to be in Payette on Monday and Tuesday, Coeur d'Alene June 5th and 6th. We just finished up the last few weeks in Burley, Pocatello, Cuna, Caldwell, and all of that, and just trying to build capacity and understanding of these things. There's been no previous comprehensive analysis of walking and biking influences like this or the state crash data set. So let's do that. Let's see where the interventions lie, whether they're projects, programs, policies that the state, through its consortium of state-level agencies, can look at, and what are the needed things to improve benefits and decrease crash risk in the state for that. So what did it involve? One, an international literature review of health and behavioral data for walking and biking. And what I challenged our researcher to do is find stuff related to the Idaho context as best you possibly can. Because we can probably talk about great things about walking and biking in San Francisco, and it could be the most applicable thing we could find to Idaho, but try to get a legislator, a council member, you know, that county commissioner to understand that. That's not easy. There's very little research on active transportation in small town and rural environments. And I hope that's a message back for this one. Hey, CDC, fund some research in this stuff. It's not just about DC and Portland and Chicago and San Francisco. Crash data analysis. ITD has an incredible, and through LTAC, a crash record that goes back to 1997. And in that, like I said, are 20,000 records of those crash reports that I've kind of struggled to not get buried in the weeds of it and start to break things down more. It's so robust. Compilation of crash costs. Every year, ITD publishes a report of Idaho crash statistics, and to that is assigned a cost per crash based on the severity. So for example, the economic cost of a fatal crash are around $9.4 million. And that's related to loss of productivity, government cost, insurance costs, all of those societal costs wrapped into that. If you go down to a severe or incapacitating injury, it drops to about $400,000 or $500,000. So the fatalities drive a lot of that. And then we use what's called a health economic assessment tool. Working through ITD's modeling group, they have estimates for the state of how many walking and biking trips occur per day that we can then use some modeling to look at what those impacts are from a health perspective. And when I get to that, I'll explain some of the opportunities and limitations of that particular data. From that data, they estimate there are 387,000 walking trips per day in the state of Idaho. It's a pretty good number, right? I mean, of course, that's not everybody taking that trip when you look at our population, but trips related to a transportation-specific purpose in this state. From that, we have about $2.1 billion in annual savings from prevented deaths as they relate to those health impacts related to diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and things like that. So think of that magnitude. About 400,000 trips a day has that kind of benefit. And that's using a World Health Organization health economic assessment tool for walking and biking, and using stuff like value of statistical life and some other wonky and funky measures in there. $2.8 billion in annual healthcare cost expense savings as a result of the people that are walking in Idaho today. That's a pretty good number to put out there. And one of the things I always try to do with this is kind of go, does it make sense? Because we're kind of used at a congressional level and maybe a state legislative level of seeing these things, and that's what we purposely ask the researcher to do in this model is don't overassume, be very conservative, and when we have to make a choice with a number and a multiplier, let's go with the lowest value so we're not overrepresenting it, knowing that there are some limitations in the data.
Savings to who? The healthcare providers or the...
System-wide, individual, state, all of those things wrapped in to one. The limitation of this, however, is based on a couple of things. One, a lot of this analysis that's done, especially at statewide levels, is done through what's called a state household travel survey. And in the state of Idaho, only Compass, the MPO here in this region, does a specific household travel survey. Idaho has not done a state-specific household travel survey. What does Idaho do to get these numbers? There's a household travel survey that's done and has been done on a regular basis in Oregon. And when they looked at a lot of the factors, and I think they had U of I working on some of this as well, if they remove the Portland metro area from that household travel survey, the rest of Oregon data from a lot of other metrics starts to look very similar. So they've used approximate rates for the state of Oregon survey data, removing the Portland metro. And to me, at least at a big picture level, it makes some sense. You take away Portland metro and you look at the rest of Oregon, city size wise and things, we do have some similarities here in Idaho, as well as some very rural areas and small towns that are in there. Did you have a question? Okay. 126,000 daily bicycling trips in Idaho. So we're at about a third the number we have of walking trips. But again, not a number that's small by any means. And if we're talking to policymakers and others who have never even heard this data, you know, we've got some good things to show them. 226 million annual savings from prevented deaths for bicycling, and 629 million annual health care expense savings from that. And again, that's going into the modeling of that. Some other things we found in the research, and that is, and when you think about it, it makes sense. Increased rates of walking have greater opportunity to improve health. Why? Why would you think? What? I hear whispers. What's that? You get hooked on walking? Okay. What else?
Well, you can do it longer in life.
Longer in life? Okay. It's easier. There's no special equipment, right? All of us, I think, today are dressed to kind of go out and do it if we have a system where we feel safe. The other interesting piece is if all of us today are active and we decide to walk more, that has a greater effect than if all of us are bicycling and we decide to bike more. That's kind of what the research says there. So you can see how kind of these multiplier effects start to go there. The interesting part, though, is if I take somebody who's sedentary and they start bicycling, that value is greater than if somebody who's sedentary and starts walking. So those are kind of the things kind of in this literature review we're finding. Some other stuff we found that the relationship to increased walking trips, the most significant factor in that is the presence of a continuous sidewalk system. So all the other things we talk about destinations and things, that the single biggest factor is a continuous system. And I think that's related to just I'm probably more likely to go out and do it for all kinds of purposes if it's there versus drilling down and thinking about a grocery store here, a school there, and other things. But that's the single thing. And I think that's an important policy piece for us to get across in Idaho. If we can accomplish a completed network, especially in small towns, that's where we stand to gain the most. So what we said, we didn't want to say, hey, if we build 20 miles of sidewalk a year, we'll increase walking by this, or 20 miles of bike lanes. We don't have good enough data to assume that. So we just said, what if these rates that we currently know are estimated in Idaho increase by 5%, 10%, or 15%? Just hypothetical. So what I've done here is kind of giving you, what if we increased walking and bicycling rates by 10%? $237 million in annual savings from prevented deaths would result from that. So again, going back to kind of making a policy case, not a big number, but something that is meaningful when we look at the impacts of intervention. And $348 million in annual healthcare savings expense. And again, we tried to be very conservative in putting together those particular estimates. So any questions on that data? And what's there? Yeah?
Don, you made mention of what constitutes a walking trip, distance related thing?
Mostly, the way I understand it from how the model stuff is put is an unlinked individual trip. So I may drive in to downtown Boise. That's a driving trip. When I go to walk to lunch and walk back, those are walking trips. And I think if they're counting it the same way we count vehicular trips, walking to lunch is one trip, walking back is another, but I'm waiting for the confirmation on that. The other thing in the Idaho model that they do is they look at short trips, the kind of intra-city, and long trips, more of the state highway system for that. And so I suspect one of our recommendations is either going to be do a household travel survey to better understand these things in Idaho. And heck, if ITD wants to do it, and you also got Department of Health and Welfare, maybe we have a better opportunity to get the numbers for that. Our cell phone data, however, is changing the paradigm of it because they're tracking you all the time and they're selling that data to traffic agencies and others. At the driving level, it's getting a little more refined. It's a little bit harder at the walking level because I've seen times if you use some of the apps, if I'm bicycling real slow, it thinks I'm a walking trip. If I'm in a car or a bus real slow, it might think it's a bicycling trip. And so I don't know between Matt or Sean, any others with, are we using any of that cell phone data yet in analysis? Not yet. I know talking to the MPO folks up in Spokane, they're starting to look to incorporate it. So it'll be interesting to see how the paradigm shifts and we get better data for that in the future.
Each
chairlift that thinks you're driving also.
Now, see, there's some pure Idaho data for you. Yeah, I'm trying to think. I've seen some work that's done in that areas, but it's still progressing. And then there's also, I think, the fact you're buying what data? You knew where I was and how fast I was going for that, because I've often wondered if you've asked me to keep a travel diary to turn into an official public agency, and I may have some trips on there I don't want to calculate. What's that? Yeah.
Who's prepared the model and who's managing it?
So the statewide traffic model, to my understanding, is contracted through University of Idaho and with a consulting firm. I forget which one, but it's based in the Northwest, and they work on a lot of the statewide models.
And that's bringing in the health information
Okay.
as well as the
So-
travel and relating it.
No, so we took the trip data from that. So when you see number of trips and we put it through this World Health Organization Health Economic Assessment Tool model, plugged in US related data and value of statistical life and other factors to get that number for it. And it's why I try to keep it to big round numbers, because I don't want to imply a level of specificity that's there. And what you'll probably see in the report is even see this stuff rounded like the nearest 10 million or something like that.
I'm sure you would have it, but you have this broken out by demographics, ages? I mean, is there a concentration? Should you be more with kids to encourage them to walk and bike versus the older dudes? Or?
Good question. The model doesn't get that sensitive. We know from some of the research, but we budget and resource-wise, we were kind of confined, but in drilling down to some of that stuff. And I think kind of as a next step recommendation and trying to understand that better, it would be very helpful. And I'll tell you an example of that. In the way we calculate this term value of statistical life, in the transportation realm, they look at it in a very drastic way. It's preventing a fatality, a very abrupt moment where something occurs in a traffic crash. When health professionals look at that same metric, they look at incremental improvement of a life over time. And even in just looking at those two different ways, you can get very different numbers of that value of statistical life. Because we were looking at transportation and we have data from what Federal Highway Administration and National Highway Traffic Safety use, we decided to go with those numbers to keep it consistent. So even in that, we could get into kind of this circular argument on those things. The other point too is when we looked at other states that did this analysis, New Mexico, Colorado, Alaska, we feel that they had a shortcoming in how they estimated this, because they looked at just applying the state's mortality rates. And that includes all ages. And the mortality rate issues for somebody that's older is very different. And so that's why I was pleased to have the health researcher from Idaho on board to go, well, wait a minute. You could be 75 years old, start walking and biking all you want, and you still may die next year because of that age. So I forget the term she did an age-adjusted mortality rate for it that we think gets us to probably a more conservative number than we saw in those other studies. Molly?
It does seem important to get kids out walking and biking because it's so hard to overcome childhood obesity.
Establishing habits, childhood obesity. When you look at the health number for Hispanics in Idaho, that number is dramatic compared to that. And one of the shortcomings we have in the crash data is we don't have race-related information for it, where a lot of other states do. When I was doing this in North Carolina, we knew that the state population was 20% African American, but 44% of the pedestrian crash victims were African Americans. And 50% of the child pedestrian crash victims were African American. That's a big discrepancy, and it's probably more of a proxy for socioeconomic conditions than other things. And so we suspect if we were to be able to break this data down that way, we would start to find some of those other things. So jumping into crash data for the last little bit. This one I love because it's like, go ahead kids, the signal says walk. Right there, right? But what's the biggest selling vehicle in Idaho? High-profile vehicles. And we've got some things there. So 43% of pedestrian crashes in Idaho, this is looking over the last 10 years of data, 2006 to 2015, involve a high-profile vehicle, a pickup truck, an SUV, a van. But 63% of the pedestrian fatalities involve a vehicle of that class type. So kind of an overrepresentation of that. One, it's just an issue of kinetic energy. Higher volume, the higher mass of a truck, of a pickup, over a Honda Civic traveling at the same speed is going to have more of an impact on a person's body, as well as what I said, the high-profile nature hitting you in that zone. Plus, a higher profile vehicle means you're more likely to go under when hit versus kind of cascading across the top of it. So based on other data, we tend to think that's an indicator of this. And interestingly, the 43% involvement was consistent for all 20 years of the data. The 63% is the last 10 years. From 1997 to 2005, it was 47%. So we've seen a 16% increase in the raw numbers of those vehicles and that rate. And I just did all that calculation from pivot tables this Monday, so don't ask me anything deeper on that. I'm still trying to understand it. Bicyclist side, still 43% of the crashes are there, so it's consistent across those two data sets. And just to give you an example, for the 20 years, there's 600,000 bicyclist crash records and 4,000 pedestrian crash records. So the reason we went with 20 years is to get a data set big enough to be able to pick out some trends for this. 50% of the bicyclist fatalities involved the higher profile vehicles. This one was also up significantly. I think it was 37% in the first 10 years of the data versus this 50% in the last 10 years. So that tends to correspond with that Insurance Institute for Highway Safety report that we had. Semi-trucks are only involved in 1% of the crashes involving a bicyclist, but represent 17% of the vehicles involved in fatalities. And that's kind of the obvious, that mass, that speed, probably a little indication of what might happen in rural areas versus cities where that exposure might be a little different. But like I said, this is coming out of stuff from Monday and Tuesday, so I haven't gotten too deep on the thinking of it. Seniors. Seniors are interesting. 7.7% of the pedestrian crash victims are senior citizens over the age of 65. That population cohort represents about 14% of Idaho's population. So in terms of crashes, they're underrepresented. In fatalities, they're overrepresented. 24% of the fatalities in the state involving a senior citizen. And we kind of talked through those issues earlier. One, exposure, limitations on the body and ability to withstand those particular impacts. Child pedestrian crashes, other side of the spectrum. This one was interesting because a lot of the data I've seen, especially the work in looking at 20 years of North Carolina data, was it ended up being very similar. 40.6% of pedestrian crash victims are youth, 19 and under, and that's slightly higher but not a ton higher than our population proportion, but they represent 16% of the fatalities, so kind of an opposite relationship as that. And like I said, I don't understand fully what's making that shake out there. That was interesting. Other side of it, and this I think gets to the speed and facilities issues. We know in this state, 13% of the roads are managed by ITD. So a very small percentage of our roads in this state are there. But 42% of the pedestrian fatalities occur on ITD road. And we were in a panel earlier this week where another local elected official said, well, pedestrian safety isn't really an ITD issue, and others have to look at it. I'm like, no. And this particular one is a man in a wheelchair using the two-way left turn of Chinden where there aren't sidewalks. And when we look at what our region's, one of our top transportation priorities is to widen this road to the west in Meridian without really affecting what's happening here. This one, this sign is from Glenwood. Pedestrian, use the nearest crosswalk. They're 2,000 feet away. And so at the same time, while we've done nothing to do access control to businesses, and cars are free to roam and turning out of this, we're asking pedestrians to walk 2,000 feet. We're going to take risks and do those things if we don't reform some of our thinking on that. So to me, as a state policy issue and working with cities and overcoming either funding gaps or other things, it's critical to get at some of that. And here's why I think those statistics may be worse. LTAC has a great resource. It's all the crash data sets for the state. You can break it down by IT district and then road jurisdiction, and in most cases cities. For Boise, it's all of Ada County, so it's a little harder to parse in the map between the cities. You can also toggle between local and state highway system crashes for that. And so this is Moscow. This is 2011 to 2016, and let me get my notes out on this. Crashes on the local system, pedestrian and bicyclists. The black are fatalities. The red are serious disabling. The orange works its way down to that. So in Moscow, in that 6-year time frame, there are 30 total pedestrian crashes and 59 total bicyclist crashes. 22 of the 30 in this map are coded to the local highway system, and 38 of the 59 are coded to that. If I look at the crashes coded to the state highway system, it's 8 pedestrian and 21 bicyclists. And is Chris Bosley from Coeur d'Alene in this session? He's not. I've been working with Chris to kind of understand this too. And I'll give you an example. If I am walking across 9th in downtown Boise at front, I'm walking parallel to front, and a vehicle turns off of front and hits me in that crosswalk, that is coded to the local system, not the state system, even though those intersections are controlled by the state. So what I have done, starting with the 15 largest cities, is drill down into the geographic of that. So in the system now in the data, it shows 32% of those crashes in total in Moscow occurring on the state system. But we have ones that are occurring at the intersections of state highways that are coded to the local system. And in Moscow alone, 22 of the 89 crashes are ones that, based on that, we would move over to the state system in doing it. And like I said, a lot of times I think it's just, hey, they were crossing this road. That's what it gets coded at. And so if I'm looking at a long-term policy and trying to understand this, this is going to be a big one. They end up being our higher speed roads. And we just had the discussion on Front and Myrtle and CCDC study the other day. We know that pedestrian signal timing is often set to the federal minimums in crossing those roads as to not delay more vehicles on the state highway system. We know the gaps are greater. And even back to this photo of the seniors, this is in Cascade. When Cascade was presented with a development application for Family Dollar said, whoa! You know, if you make us build sidewalks on State Highway 55, we might just go to McCall and build there. And you know what the city of Cascade said? We don't want you to leave. We don't want you to do anything. We're not going to require you to build sidewalks. And I've got a progression of these two ladies coming from the Cascade Senior Center, crossing here on Highway 55, walking on the shoulder of it, and then walking through the grass of the Family Dollar to get to the Family Dollar there. So it's a local policy issue, and I'll even, with Mark here in the front of the room, give him credit. He was up there when we were doing some pedestrian planning up there, and Cascade said, we need your help with pedestrian planning. Okay, why does the Family Dollar not have sidewalks? Well, they don't want them. We told them we don't want them to go to somewhere else. Well, let's have you enforce your own policies, and I think you were able to get, at least for the resurfacing project, a couple feet extra on the shoulder to at least give people some wider space for that. So we've got some other things to look at in that. But to me, that's probably one of the offset of that is probably one of the more interesting findings in the data. So crash costs, going back to that value of statistical life and other things. $163 million is the annual average economic cost of pedestrian crashes. That's taken the 20 years worth of data, putting it in 2016 dollars based on ITD and NHTSA figures. So again, if we're talking about, hey, state, can we get $2 million a year in state dedicated funds for this? Well, we know we've got $163 million negative impact on the people of Idaho, on our government, on our people, and on our other systems for that. The annual economic cost of pedestrian deaths is $121 million of that. And so that multiplier is a lot greater. On the bicyclist side, $72 million annual economic cost of bicyclist crashes, and about $24 million of that. A lower percentage of the bicyclist crashes are fatal when compared to the pedestrian ones. And I think here in Ada County, if I look at the cost between fatal, disabling, injury, evident injury, and injury, you start to see almost in thirds the cost: fatal, serious, and evident. And that to me, and I don't know if you guys addressed it in the session before, I think what that represents in Ada County of more of an equilibrium is a factor of three things. One, we have more people bicycling. You're going to have more crashes. More people out doing something, more conflicts, you're going to have more crashes. We also have a better, more comprehensive system of bike lanes and other things, and probably in terms of a percentage in Idaho, one of the highest. And so having the dedicated facilities is going to help mitigate the more fatal incidents. Third piece, more people who drive also bike. So the understanding that's there, and what I'm trying to do in the next month is look at these severity rates for the 15 largest cities for bicycling to try to see if that theory plays out. In other kind of more mature bicycle infrastructure systems, we do see that. Crashes go up, but the curve in terms of cost of crashes and fatalities starts to look very different. So the last thing here, crash rates by cities. We're looking at the top 15 cities in Idaho population-wise, top 14 by population, and then we've combined Haley, Ketchum, and Bellevue to capture Wood River Valley in that. I only have this work done so far for pedestrian crashes. I haven't done it yet for bicyclist crashes, but we're looking at a per capita rate, or a per 10,000 people, to try to normalize these rates and understand what cities might have higher rates for that. So when we look at crashes per 10,000 people, you can kind of see we have Coeur d'Alene, a very high crash rate. Twin Falls, Rexburg, a very high crash rate. Eagle, a very low crash rate. Meridian, a very low crash rate. Why do you think that might be? Yeah, probably not as many walking trips occurring in those places. So this is kind of a shortcoming of looking at it this way, but because we don't have data for like vehicle miles traveled or pedestrian miles traveled, we don't really have a better way to look at it than a per capita rate. This and this is the state average of Idaho, right around 30. So you can see those cities that comparatively are higher and lower than the state rate. And then the yellow is the state rate for the 15 largest cities only. And so you see really these handful that are over make up the bulk of driving that particular average. And like I said, I'm trying to get to understand this better. I think one of the recommendations will likely be, hey, let's get some better data on this stuff and see what's there. So when we look at fatality rates per 10,000, the numbers start to change a little bit. So over here we had Boise, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho Falls, Rexburg, Twin kind of at the top. Rexburg and Twin remain high, while the others tend to fall off a little bit. And you can see where Coeur d'Alene went really low. Coeur d'Alene has a really low percentage of fatal crashes as a total of overall crashes compared to most of the rest of the state there. Rexburg, a big student presence and other things going there. We think that is part of the influence of that. And when we look at state and the 15 largest cities rates, you can then kind of see how they're compared to state and largest city rates. Fatality rates are very similar.
And again, trying to make an understanding of what this is and give some indications. And I think most of it lies in things like the percent of crashes that are fatal versus not, and in the system that's there. We know places like Lewiston don't have much of a bicycling system, so it'll be curious to see what those percentages look like for that. So there's your heavy dose of data prior to going on downtown Boise and lunch. So any questions on that? Anything else you want to know that maybe we can still put into the report as long as we have the data?
This is awesome, I think, for us that are kind of wonky on this kind of stuff. But I wonder if our low fatality rates I mean, I think you've given me a lot of stuff to be able to go back and try to make a case for improvements or things, but I'm going to get, well, we haven't had any fatalities, we haven't had any that many crashes. How do we kind of get to that point? We say we want to prevent that from happening, but
yes. Yeah, I think I think part of the reason looking at costs and things and trying to make the case the magnitude of this is significant is a reason. For example, the other thing we don't have is like good walk rate data. The only transportation data we have on this to try to measure it is from the census. And when I look at commute trips, that's all the census has is mode to work. And when I do it by that metric, Eagle and Meridian go through the roof because they have such a low percentage of people walking and biking. But I'm going, that isn't consistent of a methodology for this. So we need things like better data just to know overall trip rates and overall miles to better get at this, because smaller data sets, smaller cities, the metrics are very different and we don't have good resources for it.
the reason they're so low is because people aren't doing it, right? And that's why we want to get people across the road.
That, and we also don't have metrics for smaller cities to try to impose on this to see if those rates are consistent. Even the National Dangerous by Design report, where they do a pedestrian danger index, is a relationship to the commute rates. But again, when I applied it here, the numbers start to fall apart really fast. So I went with the thing that seemed most consistent.
Our bike bed,
I think our ability to make that case is still lacking, where I think it might start to work on things like a sub-area basis. I know like here in Boise, Compass has the counters that they've deployed, and if say over a couple of years we were able to like do all of downtown Boise and look at those things, we could probably get some better, but from an intensive standpoint to get all that, it would be yeah, but maybe even when Compass does a household travel survey next time, adding some questions and other things, or even doing a statistically valid survey of the region to understand some of those might start to get us to a better level of understanding.
talked about a higher rate of walking and biking producing more. I look for an example that went the other way, even if it's Portland, Oregon, which supports the cyclists, has in December, and there was a guy in black with no lights on his bike, and the driver still managed to see him and keep him safe. So it doesn't have to be that way, and I think an example
Of that critical mass decreasing the fatal rate. Yeah.
Or the policy is we want this, look straight and look at how low the crash.
And I'd love to find like a city similar to Boise in size and understand, say, miles of bike length as a percentage of the arterial and collector system and compare that. Yeah, so that's a good one. I think kind of writing that in as the next step comparative piece would be good.
Otherwise, it's both. Don't let them ride walk and our crash doesn't look great. No one.
Any others? Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Great work.